Hi everyone, my name is Mary Drewnoski, and today I'm going to talk about management of winter hardy small cereals for silage. Given the current weather conditions, forage is likely to be short this year, and making small cereal silage might be an option for some of you, especially if you happen to have a neighbor who maybe planted some small cereals as a cover crop, for instance. Or you may have some small cereals that you might decide to take for silage rather than harvesting for grain. So today we're going to talk about some of the management considerations and how to get the best out of your small cereal silage. Okay, so the first thing I really want to point out is that, there's really kind of three different winter hardy species that are commonly used for small cereal silage. There's cereal rye, which is probably the most of you are familiar with, winter wheats, and also another common one, and then winter triticale, which is a hybrid of cereal rye and winter wheat, and definitely gets some good traits from both of them. However, the seed's a little bit more expensive, and so it's probably not as commonly utilized, but it really has some benefits in that it does tend to yield quite well, and it also tends to have very high quality forage. Although I would say that with any of these species, variety matters a lot, and you can have just as much variation among varieties as across species in some instances. So if we look at this picture here, I have Elbon rye and a variety non-stated rye, which were both planted in the same fields, the same fertility conditions, same time of planting. Really the only difference was the variety. And this is a really early time point for both of them. It's early April. This stuff was planted in the middle to late September. But really just wanted to point out, look at the difference in these two species in terms of, in these two varieties in terms of maturity. The Elbon rye, which is a southern rye, breaks dormancy a little bit earlier. It actually has gone to head, so it's in its heading stage, whereas we're still likely in boot, maybe just a little bit before boot for the variety non-stated. And so again, variety does matter. The variety non-stated here is likely a northern rye because that's typically what we get in Nebraska when we get a variety non-stated. Okay, so I do want to point out that planting date does matter in terms of yields. And so for most of Nebraska, the September 18th is the date at which, when we plant later than that, we actually start reducing yield. Now, I do want to point out that even down to October 10th, we're still at 80% of the maximal spring yield. But every day delay beyond September 18th, you're going to get a little bit of a yield drag. Now, does this mean that you shouldn't plant any later than this date? No, I'm not saying that at all. I know plenty of people who plant in mid-October or even late October and harvest for silage, but you do have to recognize that you're getting a yield drag. You're not getting as much yield as you could. And so targeting the fields that you're going to harvest the earliest to go ahead and put in these winter hardy species so you can maximize your yields probably makes sense. By the way, if you're in southeast Nebraska, of course you have a bit of a benefit in terms of the little bit of a later winter that we have, and so you can go a little bit later and still get those good yields. Okay, so I'm going to talk quite a bit about harvest and the stage of maturity at harvest, because stage of maturity at harvest has probably more impact on the yield and forage quality than likely anything else that we could talk about today. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page about stages. And so just briefly here, I have a picture of boot stage. And boot stage is, of course, before any heads are out. In fact, where you'll find the head is this is the flag leaf or the upper leaf, and the head is just below the flag leaf, and you can kind of see it bulging out here. That would be considered boot stage. So boot stage is kind of the first stage that we usually start talking about harvest. The next stage is anthesis. Some people call it flowering or bloom, and basically you can see the yellow pollen is out on the head, and so the head's fully out and it's starting to pollinate. That's anthesis. The next one I'm going to talk about is milk stage, and that one's fairly self-explanatory. The head's out, the seed's starting to fill, and if you pinch that seed, you're going to get a white milky substance coming out of that seed. Usually the seed is still green at that point. And so then moving from milk to soft dough, the difference is that when you pinch it, you no longer get a milky substance, but you actually get a doughy substance. So it's solid now instead of liquidy. And again, we're starting to transition from green to a yellow seed color. Okay, so I wanted to show you here that we have 3 different species. So we have rye, triticale, and wheat. We planted all these in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was just really wanting to show you kind of the differences in date of when they hit our various stages of maturity. And my hypothesis going in was the rye was going to hit maturity the earliest and was going to be the earliest to harvest throughout, and that wheat was going to be the slowest. And in fact, didn't quite work out that way for me. The rye and triticale really just went head to head. They were almost identical in this situation. Now we did plant these about the 15th of October, and they did have nitrogen added to them. It was 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I will tell you that we had another triticale that we did not add nitrogen to because we were actually testing adding some legumes. The legumes did not compete well with our triticale, so we ended up just having an unfertilized triticale. And what was really interesting to me was that the triticale that wasn't fertilized went through all the stages of maturity much quicker than these fertilized small cereals. And so not only does that explain why they probably yield less, but it also really shortened the window for harvest and makes getting them harvested at the proper stage even more difficult. So there's some advantages to fertilizing, not just from a yield standpoint, but also in this case from harvest, ability to get it harvested when you want to, so to speak. Okay. So we have rye, triticale, and wheat, and as I expected, the wheat was a little bit later to get to boot stage, but what was intriguing to me is that it actually hit soft dough earlier than the rye and triticale. So it has a much more collapsed time frame to going through those stages after it hit boot than the other two. The other thing I really want to point out is just how quickly they moved from stage to stage. We were really a week to 10 days in between each stage. So you can very quickly have one rainfall change the quality of that forage significantly. Okay, so let's talk about when you might target harvesting, because there's some different options, of course. If you really need high quality forage, you might be shooting for something like boot, so an early stage. And I just really want to point out here that the moisture content in boot and anthesis is very wet. You cannot direct harvest it. You have to wilt it for 12 to 24 hours, and that's really going to depend a lot on of course, the conditions that you're harvesting. Is it hot? Is it windy? That'll affect how long you actually have to wilt it. But those two stages will require wilting. So you'll have to cut them and let them wilt some before you chop them. We really want to target with small cereals that 65 to 70% moisture. Now that's a little bit wetter than what we might typically suggest for corn silage, maybe 60 to 65 on, sorry, 60 to 65 on corn silage. But with small cereals, we have a hollow stem. And so we need a little bit more moisture just to help with the packing. So a little bit wetter is okay. Now, not wetter than 70. So we're really going to play a fine line there, 65 to 70. So if we look at milk, milk stage actually hits that moisture content where you could likely direct harvest, especially in late milk. You would be perfect. Soft dough, if you get too late in soft dough, we may be a little bit too dry and it may be very hard to pack. So the change from late milk to early soft dough for a direct harvest target makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, if you have a lot of fields to do, then you may not be able to start at that point, because by the time you get done, you may be too late into the soft dough. So you're gonna have to time it based off of course, your conditions and your situation. But that's a good target, late milk to early soft dough as the optimal based off of moisture. What about quality? Well, before we get to quality, let's talk about yield. So most people would expect, right, that as the forage matures, we get more yield. This is what the yield of those species were, and you can see there really wasn't a lot of difference among the species, but of course, stage had huge impact. So stage of maturity, we had on a dry matter basis about 3 tons of dry matter at the boot stage, just a little bit more than that. And by the time we get down to soft dough, we have doubled the yield. And so depending on what you need, if you need really high quality stuff, you may shoot for boot. If you're looking for a good balance of quality and yield, you might look at some later stages. So let's talk about crude protein first. Boot stage. Unfortunately, I didn't get analysis done on the wheat, but you can see that very, very high crude protein at boot stage, 17, 18% crude protein. And as we continue to mature, of course, we decrease that protein content. But even at soft dough, with the situation where we added the 60 pounds in, we are getting about 10% crude protein. So that looks pretty doggone good for most beef feed situations. We would have a fairly decent forage source there. Okay, what about energy? Well, this is some data from a wheatlage experiment that we did in Holdridge, Nebraska. And we did harvest a little bit earlier than boot in one situation. So we got it at flag leaf. And I just really wanted to show you here the energy value. Again, 70% at flag leaf, very similar at boot. So very, very high quality forage, better than most situations in beef cattle that we would actually need. So you could use it as a supplement to a lower quality forage, or you could delay harvest a little bit, get down to say soft dough stage, and have something that's still pretty doggone good, 60% TDN. That's better than most hays that I would see in the beef world. And again, 10% crude protein. Now, between boot and soft dough, there's a lot of stages, right, that we haven't talked about. And I did want to show you that there is something you need to be aware of. So if we look at this graph, this is basically the line for energy. You can see that protein, in the protein line, we have kind of a constant decrease as we go from that early vegetative stage all the way through the stage that we talked about, boot, heading, milk, dough, and then ripe seed. We're just declining. But look at energy. Energy declines until we hit late head. Right before the milk stage, we hit the dip in energy, and then we start increasing. And most of you are thinking about, hey, you're like, how does that happen? Well, in this case, we have our small cereal, which means that we have a grain. And as the grain starts being produced, we actually start getting a bump in energy. So the plant itself, right, that leaf and that stem, it's constantly declining in digestibility because it's getting more mature, we're getting more fibrous, we're getting more lignin, and so we get less energy. But then as we start having that head fill, that head starts contributing to energy because we start getting starch. So the worst time to harvest is probably late head, right? Because if you just waited a little bit longer, you get more yield and more energy. So waiting until milk may make sense if you're targeting those later stages and some higher yields. Okay, so let's take just a second and talk about how fermentation happens and how you preserve silage and what you can do to ensure that you're going to get a better ensiling. So first thing here is that the first phase is with oxygen, right? So when we make silage, we put silage down in layers and then we pack it with our tractor, right? And we're just trying to get out the oxygen. And that's why we're targeting that 65 to 70% moisture. We're going to target putting in small layers, 4 to 8 inches at most, so that you're actually getting it packed. We're going to have a lot of tractor weight. You may need multiple tractors depending on how quickly that silage is coming in. If you're using a custom harvester, they usually have huge capacity for chopping, which means that you can have a lot of tonnage coming in per hour, and so you need a lot of tractor weight, and one may not be enough. Also, anything you do to prevent compaction in the field is not beneficial when you're trying to pack silage. So if you have dualies, that's not as beneficial as not having dualies. Of course, tracks on your tractor would, or tracks on your tractor would not be as good. And so we want to think about having enough weight, so 800 pounds of tractor weight per ton per hour. So for every hour that you have, every ton per hour that you have coming in, you want 800 pounds of tractor weight so you can get a good pack. The other thing you can do to help exclude more oxygen so you get through this first phase more quickly, because this first phase, you're creating CO2. Well, CO2, you got to think about it as carbon, and carbon is dry matter. And guess what carbon's leaving? Your best carbon, the sugar, right? Or the starch. You don't want that. You want that to be given to the animal. You don't want it going off into the air, right? You don't want the bacteria and the mold eating that, right? So you want to give it to your cattle. So we want to get through this stage as quickly as possible, which means we need to exclude as much oxygen as possible. Okay, so we're going to have all those things we just talked about, and that's going to help reduce the length of this phase. The other thing to consider here is that the amount of heat that you have can have an impact on the availability of the protein. And so we don't want to have a whole lot of heat production. Basically, I always say if you put your hand into a silage pile and it's hot, you're burning money. And that can be on either side. That can be during this initial phase as well as during the feed out phase. If the silage is hot, you are losing dry matter, and the dry matter you're losing is the good stuff. So if it's hot, you're burning money. Okay, what else can you do? You get through that oxygen present stage because you tried to exclude as much oxygen as possible, and then the bacteria and mold use up the rest. Assuming that you have it in a situation where it's packed enough to keep the oxygen out, and hopefully you covered it. Okay, so the next stage is you start producing acetic acid. Acetic acid is good. It does start dropping the pH. It also is anti-yeast and mold, and so you stop getting that activity going and you start going purely to bacteria. That's beneficial, but you want to get to the next stage as quickly as possible, which is you want lactic acid being produced. Lactic acid is good because lactic acid drops the pH more quickly and gets you to that stable phase more quickly. When we talk about pickling, and pickling is actually we use vinegar, right, in the kitchen to pickle, which is acetic acid, but we actually want more lactic acid being produced for silage. And so one of the things we can do to get more lactic acid being produced more quickly, of course, is make sure that we have content for those bacteria, which means that the later stage, like soft dough, where you have a bit of starch, is beneficial because that starch is available to those bacteria and they can utilize it. Lactic acid producing bacteria really like sugars and starch. So more sugar and starch we have present, the better. In fact, at earlier stages, there are some people who suggest, if I'm going to say harvest at boot, that I might add a little bit of ground corn as I'm packing, and that's just to feed those lactic acid producing bacteria. Okay, so the other thing to consider is whether or not to use an inoculant. And as we think about inoculants, there's kind of two types of bacteria that we inoculate with. One is the homofermentive bacteria, and they are the ones that produce lactic acid solely. And so those guys are really targeted at reducing silage pH as quickly as possible, so you keep as much dry matter as possible, i.e. you don't have as much CO2 coming off because we moved into more and more lactic acid production, got the pH down so low that bacteria stop munching away at our silage. The heterofermentive bacteria, they produce both acetic acid and lactic acid. And the benefit of acetic acid, as I said before, it stops mold and yeast. And so that is beneficial more on the other end, which is the feed out end. If we have more acetic acid, it can reduce the loss during that feed out period. Now, it's not magic. It's not going to keep it stable when it's exposed to oxygen for days on end, but it might reduce the amount of loss during that 24-hour period between feedings, and it may reduce the amount of loss in the bunk. So a lot of inoculants have both types, but there are inoculants that have one or the other. So make sure you know why you're inoculating. With small cereals, sometimes you don't have as much of the homofermentive bacteria on that small cereal, especially if you're harvesting in earlier stages because the weather typically is cooler and you're coming out of the winter and you have cooler conditions. You just don't have those bacteria growing as multiplying as quickly. So the native bacteria population may not be as robust as later. Now, that's not to say that even later stages harvesting and inoculating might not be beneficial. It all depends on what the weather conditions are like. Cool weather conditions, you won't have as many of those bacteria. I will say small grain silages, I see more payback than we typically do in corn silage because we do often have some good populations of those native bacteria. Okay, so targets, all the things we kind of talked about. 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I think that's a reasonable target unless you have a lot of residual nitrogen in the field from the previous crop. But putting on that nitrogen pays from the tonnage standpoint. It also gives you a little bit more time between stages to try to target the right stage for harvest for your goals. If you're looking at most beef situations, late milk to early soft dough is probably a good target. Again, you're going to have to adjust that based off of what your goals are, as well as how much you have to harvest. If you have a lot of acres to harvest, you may have to start targeting earlier just to get through so that you do have enough moisture left and you're not going beyond soft dough. 65 to 70% moisture is a good target. 3/8 to 1/2 inch chop length. So I didn't talk about this, but chop length is really helpful in causing you to be able to pack it easier when you're in that packing phase of making your silage. And remember, these have hollow stems, so finer than corn silage is better. So we're talking 3/8. If you can get that done, that's really great. 1/2 inch at the largest. Remember, enough pack tractor weight. Don't be afraid to have multiple tractors. It's very, very beneficial, and it pays back dividends in terms of the amount of forage you recover and the feed quality. And then the last thing, cover. I know it's a huge pain, and a lot of people really hate covering. They hate dealing with covering. They hate dealing with taking the cover off. It takes a lot of labor, and let's face it, you may not have the labor. But think about being creative. And maybe talk to the local 4-H or FFA and see if they're looking for a fundraiser possibility and paying them to come out and cover. And if you can do it within the first 24 hours. It's really worth it. You're going to get less waste. And I know you probably look at an uncovered silage pile and you go, oh, it's only 10 inches of that black nasty stuff. That's okay. Well, especially if you're doing piles, you have a lot of surface area. That 10 inches is actually from about the first 3 feet. That's how much you've lost. So you lose a lot by not covering. And then the other thing is that black stuff that's there. Let's face it, you're not pitching it, right? You're putting it into the TMR, you're putting it into the diet of those animals. And that stuff has so much mold in it that it actually negatively affects the rumen bacteria. And it, in fact, has a negative feed value. It's not just no feed value, it's a negative feed value. So reducing how much of that you have is going to be beneficial from the animal standpoint as well. Now, if you are in the situation where you don't have your own small cereals to harvest, but you're looking over at the neighbor, and you're trying to figure out how to price it, we do have a tool, which I will put the link in the description so you can check that out. But this can kind of help you and your neighbor price that forage standing in the field, and also think about all the things that you need to talk through, especially harvest date and when you have to have it off by. That's a really important thing if you're trying to harvest somebody else's field. I hope that this information was useful for you, and if you have questions, put them down in the comments and I will try to get to them. And if you like this content, of course, let me know. If you have other things you want me to address, put them in the comments as well, and hopefully I'll be able to help you out.